BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. Black Box Ned 88 on Instagram TV for the bonus podcast. Today we're going to be revisiting the case that has been made by Gary L. Stewart in regards to his Zodiac killer suspect, Earl Van Best Jr. And we really should say that this is more than just Gary Stewart, because there are three people that get involved in the publishing of materials surrounding Earl Van Best, and they are Gary Stewart himself, the biological son of Earl Van Best, as well as Susan Mustafa, the co-writer, and Michael Wachschel, who is the author of the companion book, The End of the Zodiac Killer Mystery. Now, we've talked about their stuff on the channel before, but one of the things that I had wanted to do for a while was to go through the documentary version of The Most Dangerous Animal of All by Gary Stewart and Susan Mustafa. It was turned into a documentary that was put out on FX, and I've been watching it on Hulu. If anyone has Hulu, you can see that included in the subscription. So I watched that one, and I should also say, though, on this channel, we've done a 9-part discussion series on Earl Van Best Jr. as a Zodiac killer suspect, exploring Gary Stewart and his claims in the book, The Most Dangerous Animal of All, as well as also doing a piece on the Michael Wachschel theory. What do we have to say about all of this? First, I would like to say a few praiseworthy things about Gary Stewart and his suspect, Earl Van Best Jr. And you could apply this to the Zodiac killer mystery no matter what suspect anyone is looking at. Number one, the letter Z was chosen for the name Zodiac prior to the Zodiac killer taking on the full name. First, the letter Z was chosen, then the full name Zodiac was chosen. And in the Gary Stewart theory, it goes that Earl Van Best Jr. chose this one very specifically because it's a combination of the letters E and V. If you were to invert E and invert V at certain angles, you can make the two letters match up into something that would look like a Z. E for Earl and V for Van Best. And you could put that together, and that was chosen 1966 or prior, because Gary Stewart does insist that Earl Van Best Jr. murdered Sherry Jo Bates. At least he did back in 1966. Or at least he did when he published the book, The Most Dangerous Animal of All, we should say. Okay, so that's one thing. The second one is that the word Zodiac was chosen because it's coming from the Greek zoion, meaning animal, the most dangerous animal of all, that the Zodiac killer was trying to become the zoion, to say that he was above all of humanity, that he was so smart and so brilliant that he was just above everyone. That's the second thing. And the third is, there's one of the ciphers that is called the Z13 cipher. These are all named because of the number of characters in them, the 408, the 13, and the 340. And in the Z13 cipher, there are 13 letters, and it says, my name is, there are 13 letters in Earl Van Best Jr., if you abbreviate Jr. as JR, and I really counted them out, like EARL, 1, 2, 3, 4, and it turns out, yes, indeed, there are 13 letters, so that some of the uncoded messages in the ciphers could simply mean that you need to look for somebody who has a name that would fit the number of characters in that cipher. There are also 18 letters at the end of the 408 cipher? 18 characters, we should say. And that is one of the explanations that has been provided by Gary Stewart. Okay, just throwing out some interesting ideas. This documentary series, The Most Dangerous Animal of All, once again, I saw it on Hulu, it's balanced. They give Gary Stewart a full platform to say everything that he wanted. They give Susan Mustafa, the co-writer, a full platform to say everything that she wanted. They gave Michael Wachschel some time, although he doesn't really contribute too much in any single way, even in his writings. But the thing is, though, they also brought up some very bold counterclaims in regard to the Gary Stewart theory about Earl Van Best being the Zodiac killer. To give a little bit of background, as well as we can in a nutshell version, Earl Van Best Jr. was someone who was involved in a nationwide scandal known as the Ice Cream Romance or the Sunday Bride, and Paul Avery was an individual that was behind breaking the story of a man in his late 20s who seduced a 13-year-old girl at the time that he met. Her name was Judith Chandler, and she went on to become the second wife of Earl Van Best. The first wife was Marionette Player. His second wife was Judith Chandler, but she was only 14 when they signed the marriage documents. Later, it would be annulled. I believe they got married in Nevada, but they had to get the marriage annulled because Judith was underage at the time. And then they went on this crazy wild goose chase around America and Mexico, mind you, trying to escape the police because they're on the lookout for Earl Van Best Jr., thinking that he is a sexual predator, which he in fact was. I mean, so that is how Earl Van Best received a little bit of national attention. And the next thing to say is, Earl Van Best and Judith Chandler were separated. Of course, they had a kid in the meantime. His name was Gary Stewart. He was also named after Earl Van Best Jr. originally. He was also Earl Van Dorn Best. And Earl Van Best Jr. left Gary Stewart in the stairwell of an apartment building, just abandoned him, and then returned to Judith Chandler. Eventually, they get the marriage annulled, and they are separated completely. So then, Earl Van Best marries for a third time to a woman named Edith Kos, K-O-S. And they're married up until about 1970. It really appears in 1970 that they separated, and Edith Kos was from Austria. Earl Van Best was fluent in English, German, and Japanese, and he most likely knew Spanish. So that was how they bonded over their connection to the German language, and Edith went back to Austria around 69 or 70, and I mean, some of those things are even difficult to track down precisely, as they mentioned in the FX documentary. So what do we say about all this? What would be the motivation for the Zodiac murders? Very quickly, that Earl Van Best never got over the heartbreak of losing Judith Chandler, this woman that he had been in love with, that he had been separated with, and it's not really love, it's just power and control. And the Zodiac victims were chosen, the female victims, because they had a resemblance to Judith Chandler. When I was reading this in the book, The Most Dangerous Animal of All, I was like, wait a second, they don't all look the same. I mean, Betty Lou Jensen, Darlene Ferrin, and Cecilia Ann Shepard. Betty Lou Jensen and Darlene Ferrin have some definitive similarities. Cecilia Shepard looks completely different. And we also said that Gary Stewart is accusing the Zodiac killer, Earl Van Best, of murdering Sherry Jo Bates. All these women seem to look different. Well, when they were on the run, when Earl Van Best and Judith Chandler were on the run, Judith had to change her hairstyles from time to time. So what Gary Stewart is saying is, oh, he saw this woman and she reminded him of the way that Judith looked at this one time. Oh, he saw this woman and she reminded him of the way Judith looked at that time. And then that's why he chose the particular victims. He did not care about the men at all. He was only killing the men to get them out of the way so he would have access to the women, because he was just sort of breaking out into psychotic rage over the fact that he was separated from Judith Chandler. Never got over that, let alone he also hated his mother, and he had some father issues as well, right? So then the next thing we should say about Earl Van Best Jr. as a Zodiac killer suspect is the final Zodiac crime occurred on October 11th of 1969, and he murdered Paul Stine, the Zodiac killer did. And the reason why Gary Stewart says that Paul Stine was chosen is because Earl Van Best once worked as a taxi driver. He hated the job, he thought it was beneath him, and he developed this animosity toward people who were taxi drivers. It's possible that he knew Paul Stine. And in 1967, Earl Van Best was living in San Francisco, 2 blocks from the Pinecrest Diner, where Paul Stine supposedly picked up the person who shot him. Once again, I repeat, 1967, so he wanted to make a statement about how he disliked taxi drivers and so on. Okay, what do we make of all this? And you can hear more about this in detail in our 9-part book discussion on Earl Van Best Jr. And what I would say is that we talk about a lot of things on this channel. We make a lot of claims. We explore a lot of different ideas. And a lot of it is just putting out possibilities, or you're trying to weigh the merit of the idea. Maybe somebody said this, oh, well, I think this is a more plausible alternative. And when you're looking at something such as the possibility of Earl Van Best being the Zodiac killer, and you read Gary Stewart's book, The Most Dangerous Animal of All, I was genuinely shocked when some of the sentences that I've said about that book appeared in the Hulu documentary, the FX documentary. Multi-part series, mind you. It took some time to watch their multiple episodes. And I heard them from none other than Judith Chandler herself. After the publication of the book The Most Dangerous Animal of All, Judith Chandler and Gary Stewart had somewhat of a falling out because she didn't like a lot of the claims that he was making in the book and a lot of the things that he was saying about San Francisco and the people in Judith Chandler's life. But one of the big ones is, she's like, why are there all of these preposterous descriptions of the crime scenes of the Zodiac murders at Lake Herman Road, at Blue Rock Springs, at Lake Berryessa and the Paul Stein murder? And the response from Susan Mustafa, the co-writer, was, well, what we did was, we took the police reports, we pulled out the Zodiac and put in the words, my father, or Earl Van Best, or Van. He was referred to as Van. Earl's father was Earl Sr., and Earl Van Best Jr. went by Van. And that is exactly the claim and the case that we made in the book discussion. And Judith Chandler, of all people, is raising these questions. Or I'm just like, why on earth is it written this way? There is such a strong case for the material that they're talking about Earl Van Best and his life story and meeting Judith Chandler, the Sunday Bride, the ice cream romance. Why isn't the book just about that? Because it wouldn't sell. And in this documentary series, they openly called them out and they're like, was this just done to sell books? Was this just done because of sensationalism? Was HarperCollins just try to make a buck? Because you have to wonder, how and why did the media zone in on Gary Stewart and his suspect Earl Van Best so heavily? And when you read the book, The Most Dangerous Animal of All, the parts about Earl Van Best's biography are so well written, well researched, and well composed. The parts about the Zodiac killer are just a flimsy little pamphlet that is just wedged in there. And it's pretty much just saying, on the night of December 20th, 1968, Earl Van Best went to Lake Herman Road and he shot some teenagers. Then, on the 4th of July, he went to Blue Rock Springs Park and he shot some other people. Next, Earl Van Best drove to Lake Berryessa on September 27th of 1969. This time he decided to wear a hood and stab the victims. Later on that year, 1969, October 11th, he shot Paul Stein. There was no substance at all. I mean, they're talking about this stuff in the FX documentary like, oh, well, they built a circumstantial case. No, they didn't. There was no substance whatsoever. It's just this flimsy little description of the Zodiac murders. And by Susan Mustafa's admission, although it's hearsay according to Judith Chandler, she's just saying, well, we took the police reports, we pulled out the name Zodiac, and then we put in Earl Van Best, Van, or my father, referring to Gary Stewart's father, and they put that in there. It's very poorly done. Once again, I do insist, and I do give credit to Gary Stewart and perhaps Susan Mustafa as well, for saying that the biography of Earl Van Best, learning about the kid who just grew up trilingual in English, German, and Japanese, learning about the guy who had his family vacation ruined one summer and his cousins were bullying him and they spilled milk on his books, learning about the guy who became an antiques dealer going back and forth between Mexico, making his livelihood selling old rare books to collectors, learning about the scandalous true crime story of the ice cream romance and the Sunday Bride. Those things were excellent. But the stuff about the Zodiac killer is not even an honest attempt to convince anyone or persuade anyone that Earl Van Best was the Zodiac killer. They wrote a biography and then they just stapled on some pages, which are probably, you hit Control H or maybe F2, depending on your word processor. They took out the word Zodiac and then they put in the word Earl Van Best, and then that's all they did. It's a very poorly written set of pages in the book The Most Dangerous Animal of All. The Most Dangerous Animal of All was not profitable enough, so they decided to put them out together with a companion piece, The End of the Zodiac Killer Mystery by Michael Wachsel. I was being humorous when I said it was most profitable. It was not profitable enough. The most profitable animal of all would be the Zodiac Killer, though. They put the books out together. Michael Wachsel said in an interview that the reason why they put them out together is the books are supposed to go hand in hand. You can read Michael Wachsel's book, The End of the Zodiac Killer Mystery, first, or you can read Gary Stewart's book, The Most Dangerous Animal of All, first. Both of them talk about Earl Van Best Jr. being the Zodiac Killer, but Michael Wachsel was a handwriting expert who said very clearly that he believed using his analyses, that the Zodiac killer's handwriting in the letters is a perfect match for the marriage certificate that was signed by Earl Van Best Jr. But then it turned out the person who had signed the marriage certificate and written the names had been the priest who had married them. And what was his name? Edward M. Flieger. So then Michael Wachtel is even talking about how perhaps that Flieger wrote the letters and Earl Van Best committed the murders. They were trying to force their particular theory. It really isn't an honest attempt, but they made that revelation almost immediately after publishing the book. In addition to watching the FX documentary, I would like to give credit to WAFB-TV for providing an interview with Gary Stewart. Gary Stewart also appeared on the show Rover's Morning Glory. Rover's Morning Glory, which you can hear on YouTube here. And that host asked a very interesting question. He's like, if everything you're saying is true about your suspect, Earl Van Best Jr., why wouldn't the police just do something about it? Why would they be going to such deliberate efforts to not arrest the Zodiac killer, or to not make a revelation about the Zodiac killer? I shouldn't say arrest, because this stuff all came out after Earl Van Best had passed away in 1984, choked on his own vomit. I believe he was actually sitting in a bar in Mexico when that happened, and he was buried in or around Mexico City. But the thing to say is, about this, and some of the claims specifically, Judith Chandler as well said another thing that I was really curious about. Earl Van Best went to Mexico, right, to work in his job, antique dealing, as well as selling rare books to collectors and antique shops. And I was like, driving from San Francisco to Mexico City, that's a big drive. I mean, I guess it's possible. And I thought, when I was reading the book, The Most Dangerous Animal of All, I was like, well, perhaps he must have spent, a couple months down there. That's definitely not something that people would do on even a monthly basis, driving from San Francisco to Mexico City. It's possible, but I really didn't think that was very likely. Judith Chandler expressed that specifically. She talked about that very specifically, expressed the same idea once again. She's like, Earl Van Best didn't drive to Mexico. He flew. He took the airplane. He went there by plane. He didn't drive. And this is his ex-wife talking, mind you. And that's very relevant, because Gary Stewart's whole narrative regarding the murder of Sherry Jo Bates is very simple. Earl Van Best was driving from California, or San Francisco, California, to Riverside, California. He stopped at the RCC, Riverside City College, to see if the library wanted to be interested in buying some of the rare books that he would sell, and which was his occupation. And then he saw this girl that reminded him of Judith Chandler, and then he wrote a poem on the desk. That's the way the book is written. He saw Sherry Jo Bates. She reminded him of Judith Chandler. So while he waited for her to leave the library, he wrote a poem into the desk, and he signed it with the letters R.H., because those were the initials of his aliases, which Gary Stewart never mentioned until that point. 24 chapters into the book before he said anything to do with the Zodiac killer. And then he's talking about how Earl Van Best would have walked out of the library. He would have removed the distributor coil from her car. It's like he is just putting the famous narrative, as well as not only the police reports, also relying on the Zodiac letters, the Bates letters, Robert Graysmith's narrative, and just substituting the word Earl Van Best. And you hear this bold criticism that you've made about the case, and you've made about Earl Van Best as a Zodiac killer suspect. We talked about all of this stuff in our book discussion, and there it is, right on the screen in the FX documentary series. So it's really quite obvious that Gary Stewart was most likely, I say most likely, because there's always a chance he was a genuine believer, but he was most likely a genuine fraud from the very beginning. And that is really just kind of sad and depressing. It's sad and depressing because the media slobbered over this guy. There was so much press. You could see how many talk shows he's on, whether he's on RT or CNN, promoting his book, The Most Dangerous Animal of All, talking all about Earl Van Best Jr. as a Zodiac killer suspect. But the thing is, they just literally substituted his name in there. They had a great story, and Gary Stewart openly says that he was originally trying to write a biography of his father, which seems so obvious from reading the book, but then they learned some things about the Zodiac Killer, so they decided to add those in there. Did they really, or did they just send in a bunch of fabrications because they wanted their book to sell? What do you think about Earl Van Best as Zodiac Killer suspect? We started out with a few claims, such as that the Z13 means the Zodiac has 13 letters in his name. We also said some things about the letter Z was chosen first, and then the word Zodiac was added on later. What do you have to say about any of that stuff? If you like this upload, you can hit the like button, and if you haven't subscribed yet, you're welcome to do so. And I will see you on Instagram for the bonus podcast. Until next time.